Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of the Eclipse Quilt Along. I'm so glad to have you along, and I'm glad to be moving forward and starting our first cuts into our fabric to make our Eclipse quilt. Now, as a reminder from last week when I talked about fabric selections, I'm using, for this particular quilt, I am using the Moonchild collection by Fran Gulick of Cotton & Joy for Riley Blake fabrics. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but this collection is still readily available online. So if you wanted to make this same quilt, go ahead and look for Moonchild by Fran Gulick of Cotton & Joy. If you wanted to make the cover quilt, that is the Elegance collection by me, Corinne Wells, also known as Franny B Quilt Company for Riley Blake. It is still available in a little bit more limited selections, so you may have to do a little bit of digging on Etsy to be able to find the fabrics that you're looking for. So moving forward with this Moonchild collection, I want to make this video geared toward beginners who have not done a whole lot of fabric cutting before. If you are an intermediate or even an advanced beginner to intermediate quilter and beyond, you may not need this video quite as much. That's why I'm including instructions in the email alongside this video. So if you're not interested in following along the whole video, you definitely don't need it. I'll be adding some tips for cutting. If you want to turn it on in the background and go ahead and get started on your quilt, you are more than welcome to do that. For those of you who have not done a lot of quilt cutting before, I'm going to show you how I cut fabrics for quilting. The tools that you'll need is, of course, a cutting mat, a ruler, and a rotary cutter. And I have a nice clean blade that's going to be able to cut through multiple layers of fabric. If you spread your fabric out end to end, this is going to be about 42 to 43 inches wide, just depending on the type of fabric. So measure and make sure that you have the correct width of fabric. If you don't, you may need to adjust your measurements slightly. Your yardage is based on a 42-inch width. Riley Blake fabric is usually at least 42 inches wide. So as long as yours is that big, you won't need to adjust your yardages. If it is slightly bigger, you may actually save a little bit of fabric. If it's slightly smaller, you might need to get some extra to compensate. I like to first press by folding my fabric selvage to selvage, lay those selvages together, and then give yourself a nice seam at the bottom with your iron. This is going to help you to be able to line up your fabric when cutting. Now, if you have a nice long ruler and you only want to cut through 2 layers of fabric, then you can go ahead and cut it as folded like this. Now my ruler is long enough. This is a 24-inch ruler. So it is okay for me to go ahead and cut my width of fabric strips, just folded one time in half. However, it's not my preference. I like to fold it again. I think maybe it's just habit, but I also just feel like it feels a little more sturdy for me to be cutting through 4 layers of fabric instead of just 2. I like that feeling of cutting through those 4 layers. You want to line that fold up with one of the grid lines on your cutting mat, and your ruler should be lined up on a vertical line of your cutting surface, and then you know you have a perfect right angle and that your fabric is going to be square when you cut it. Double check through all 4 layers, or 2 if you're cutting 2, through both layers of fabric, that every piece in that stack overhangs over that vertical line so that you know when you cut it, you're cutting a perfectly straight line. So go ahead and cut that first cut, and you can save your scrap. I just like to keep my sewing surface and my cutting surface nice and clean. It helps keep the stress out of my brain, and I can just focus on the fun part. So now that we have our first clean cut, you can consult your pattern and decide which cuts you're going to make. In the pattern, you are instructed to cut background fabric, sashing fabric, cornerstone star fabric, then from each of the 4 focal print fabrics, from each of the 4 accent print fabrics, and from the binding fabrics. So we'll be cutting 6 different types, but within the focal print and the accent print, remember, you might have a different number of prints. So if you're following the pattern as written, you'll have 4 focal prints and 4 different accent prints. And remember, in my quilt that I'm doing here, my focal prints and accent prints are going to be the same. I'm just going to be swapping them on different blocks. So I will only have 4 prints here. So I'll have a total of 8 fabrics. I'll have background, sashing, cornerstone stars, my 4 focal and accent prints, and my binding fabric. So I'll have 8 different prints from which I'm cutting the strips. I like to start with one fabric and get all of my width of fabric strips done first. The reason I like to do that is because I like to use the same tools that are right here in front of me and do the same thing. It helps me to stay focused. So I'm only doing width of fabric strips first, and then move all of your strips aside and then come back and do all your subcutting. So we're going to start. This is my sashing fabric. So if I was cutting 2.5 inch width of fabric strips, then I would measure from the end of this clean cut fabric. So if I was cutting 2.5 inch strips, I would measure from this clean cut end. And I usually just count right here on my cutting mat how far I need to go, and then I line my ruler up with that measured line. So 1.5 inches. And then you're going to start cutting just slightly before your fabric so that you make sure you cut into the edge of the fabric as opposed to pushing down on the front of it. So position your rotary cutter just in front of the fabric, and then while holding your rotary cutter into that ruler, go ahead and carefully push forward to cut your first strip. And then you have a perfectly measured 2.5 inch strip that you can use in all the different parts of the quilt. And you would do the same thing if you needed 10 of these. Then you would move down the line and again measure 2.5 inches, hold it down. Well, make sure that you're all lined up first. Hold it down, again, press down into the mat and cut yourself a width of fabric strip. In the instructions, the abbreviation is WOF. That stands for width of fabric. And we are going to be cutting lots of these strips and then labeling them before we move on to subcutting. When you have your strips cut, go ahead and set them apart, or you can label them with a sticky note. If it's going to be a day or so before you start subcutting, then I always recommend labeling to make sure you have everything that you need. So here I have my background strips, my sashing strips. I only needed one size. I have all my sashing strips cut. Then I have my cornerstone star strips cut in 2 different sizes. I have my focal prints cut. Now, because these are larger squares, these are going to be larger strips, but again, with the fabric strips. And then I have each of my 4 accent print strips cut. So because my accent strips or my accent fabrics and my focal print fabrics are out of the same fabric, these are going to be the same, but yours might look different if you're using 8 separate fabrics. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 different sets of accent fabrics, and these are the same as my focal print fabrics. And then lastly, I have my binding fabric. I am not going to need my binding fabric until close to the end of the quilt. So now that I have everything I need, I have all of my width of fabric strips, it's time to dive into subcutting. You can cut your strips individually using a smaller ruler. Just make sure that you keep track of how many cuts you need out of each strip. How you fold your strip may determine how many cuts you get out of each one. Another method I like to use is to line up my cut strips right next to each other and line them up evenly on the mat so that once they're all lined up, I only have to lay down my ruler and cut through them once to get multiple subcuts out of the strips. Use it the same way that you would cut with the fabric strips, by lining up your ruler carefully with the ends of the strips. I would just advise you to use caution in counting out how many subcuts you're going to be able to get out of each strip. Again, depending on how you fold each strip, you're going to end up with a different number of cuts that you're able to get out of each strip. So just make sure you plan ahead if you use one of these methods. Whether you use the one at a time method to cut your strips or multiple strips at a time is fine, as long as you're counting as you go to make sure that you have the right number of subcuts. When you do, move on to the next size with the fabric strip, count out how many cuts you'll need, and when you have enough of those, move on to the next fabric until you have all of your subcuts finished. One note with our focal print fabrics, there's a note that says you technically need 42.5 inches. So if your fabric is slightly larger than the 42 inches, you may only need 1 with the fabric strip. That was the case with mine. So my fabric is 42.5 inches wide, so I only need one of these strips. So that means I need a little bit less fabric than what was assumed from the fabric requirements. Because some fabric may be 42 inches, then you might need that full 2 strips. So before you cut, just go ahead and make sure that your fabric is actually 42 inches wide, or 42.5 inches wide. If it is, then you only need to cut 1 strip, and you can save the rest of your fabric for another project. Okay, so I have all of my cutting finished and ready to go for next week. So week 2 is finished as soon as you have all of your cutting done. And I'll just tell you what you're going to need for next week so you'll be prepared. So we will not need the sashing or the cornerstone stars or the binding next week. So you can go ahead and set these aside. For next week, you are going to need prepared your accent prints, your focal blocks, and your background. So the way that I have organized the remainder of the fabrics is I have these focal print blocks here. These are going to make the moon shapes in the center of my Eclipse quilt. So these larger focal blocks are what I have here. And then I have paired them with the accent blocks that are going to be the sun rays around the moon. And then I'll need some pieces from the background for next week and the week after. So for the next 2 weeks assignments, this is all we're going to need. We're just going to need each of our blocks and some background pieces, and that's going to help us to build out our blocks. And then we will move on to the sashing, the cornerstone stars, and then putting the whole quilt together. Next week, we are going to start sewing. We're going to need our sewing machines. I also recommend having an ironing board or a pressing mat handy, and you will need to do some trimming. So you could have a small cutting mat and a rotary cutter next to your sewing machine if you'd like. For me personally, I like having a little setup. So I have my sewing machine, my cutting mat, my iron, and my pressing mat all right by me, and we'll whiz through it and we will get our blocks put together over the next 2 weeks. So I will see you next week. Thanks, bye-bye.